Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Overview and Scrutiny panel for Environment, Communities and Partnerships. Just wait for the final councillor to come and join us. So, moving on to the agenda, apologies. We have one apology.
Yes, we have apologies this evening from Councillor Bywater.
Thank you. Everyone had a chance to read the minutes. Anyone got any issue with the minutes? Can I sign them off? Oh, Councillor Hassel.
Yeah.
You're good.
You might use the microphone. Thank you.
Yeah, if I can take up afterwards, but I think there's a couple of things in terms of my own personal comments in the minutes. That the first being is that it gave the impression that I had an objection to the particular project, and my issue was primarily around around the funding of the project, in terms of the work the Cabinet hadn't reviewed other potential ways of spending the money, not specifically as the minutes give the impression that I was saying that we should spend the money on BAU. I was using the BAU as an example. And the other thing was I talked about success criteria for the project, because there weren't any success criteria in the project, and I wanted the Cabinet to look at that as well.
I was going to say, so the minutes are just a summary of the discussion, but obviously I can adjust that if you would like us to. I can add a section from these minutes to just sort of clarify that discussion from there, if you would like to. But obviously then we can sign these off and we'll add that into the next set as a clarification of point to these minutes.
Yeah, just to come back on that. I mean, that's fine. It's just unfortunate that Cabinet have made their decision now, and I believe we've got a session after this one to discuss how we're more effective as a committee going forward. But I think that was an important point. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Anyone else got any issue before I sign them off? Thank you.
Just give me the last page.
So, moving on to agenda item 2, members' interest. Has anyone got a declaration of interest for the item? No? Then we shall move on to agenda item 3, the working programme. Has everyone had a look at it? Anyone want to make any comments? Given what we're going to be discussing after this meeting, I think probably most of it can be discussed then. Is everyone happy with that? Yes. So let's move on to agenda item 4 then, Huntingdonshire priority natural landscapes. We've got Councillor Taylor, Helen, Nick and Martin to come and give us a small presentation, but we've hopefully all read the papers.
Thank you, Chair. Good evening, everyone. I'm pleased to present the Priority Landscape Report, which marks a significant step forward in our commitment to enhance the natural environment in Huntingdonshire. As our district continues to grow, we want to make sure we are well placed to take advantage of the opportunity to invest and enhance our rich biodiversity. And this report provides a clear roadmap for achieving that balance. The landscape identified in the report, such as the Great Fens, the Great Ouse Valley, the West Cambridgeshire Hundreds, there are 9 priority sites, including the river corridors within this report, are areas not only of immense ecological importance, but also form the backbone of our nature recovery network. By formally recognising these areas, we are ensuring that future development is guided by the principles of biodiversity net gain, as outlined in the Environmental Act 2021. This approach will allow us to restore, enhance vital habitats, making space for wildlife, while continuing to accommodate the needs of the growing population within Huntingdonshire. To reassure everyone, this work is not designated to inhibit development or growth in the district, but to acknowledge the natural recovery network for Huntingdonshire document, which was circulated as a supporting document, and I would imagine you've all read. This is as an evident base to inform our contribution to the local natural recovery strategy and future planning policy. This will assist us with making sure that the benefits of biodiversity net gain legislation are kept in the district and focused on our most valuable natural landscapes. This work is aligned with our climate strategy, and we strive to create a greener, more sustainable future for Huntingdonshire. These priority landscapes, you're right. These priority landscapes will help reduce carbon emissions, improve air, water quality, and offer greater access to nature for our residents, all of which are essential to improving well-being and supporting long-term conservation. So I welcome you all to support this report and recognise these priority landscapes within it, as they will play a key role in shaping a more resilient, nature-rich district for generations to come. Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Committee, for listening. And we'll hand you over to the experts.
Thanks, Councillor. Good evening, everybody. My name's Nick Massey and I'm the Biodiversity for All Project Manager. To give you a bit of background about this report, back in September 2023, we commissioned the Wildlife Trust to undertake an evidence-based exercise for us. The reason why we did that is because we had the capacity to do so and we were aware of the legislation that was coming in at the time. So to enable the council to prepare for the changes under the Environment Act, such as the biodiversity net gain legislation and the local nature recovery strategy, we commissioned the Wildlife Trust to undertake this work for us. To reassure the committee that this piece of work is not designed to inhibit development, it is there to aid it and to promote the growth of the natural environment alongside the development. We are not trying to give a tool to stop any planning developments or anything like that. This is purely to set out an evidence base of where our ecologically rich capital is within the district. I've managed to get Martin Barker to come along to give a presentation about how he came up with the sites and the landscapes, what tools he used, and also set out the evidence for the report as well. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. I just wanted to add to what Nick's just said. And this is not a planning policy document. I just wanted to make that clear for everyone. This is very much an evidence base, so it's creating a set of information that we're going to be able to use to feed into the local nature recovery strategy. So that's known as the LNRS, which is being led by the County Council on behalf of the CPCA. So this is actually HDC collecting as much evidence as we can so that we can feed into that process when that comes around later on this year, at which point it will come back through the process and you'll see the LNRS in its entirety for the whole of Cambridgeshire. Just wanted to clarify that for you.
Are the slides available? Oh, thank you. I'm not in control here. I don't like that. I like to have my own button usually, I think. But have I? Yes. Oh, I have. Well, hey. Which way am I going to press? I'm on it. Excellent. Right. Thanks, guys. Yes. So thank you for the introduction, Nick, Helen, Councillor. That saves me from saying a little bit, so I can perhaps and the photo here from the Wildlife Trust Houghton Meadows Nature Reserve. In terms of wetlands, there's of course Grafton Water supplying drinking water, but also nationally important for its bird populations. Little Paxton Pits, managed by Huntingdonshire District Council, and the various other gravel pits along the valley. And then out in the fens, the internationally important fen wetlands of Woodwalton Fen and Holme Fen National Nature Reserves. And these obviously support a variety of protected and priority species. Why nature recovery? I don't want to be all doom and gloom. We're trying to be positive here and look forward on what action we can take. But yes, unfortunately, habitats and species continue to decline. 44% of species where there's accurate data declined in the 10 years from 2009 to 2019. It's thought that about 1 in 7 species are threatened with extinction within the UK. Obviously, they may still be present elsewhere in Europe or other parts of the world, but and climate change is having an increasing impact on nature. Just the massive decline in insects in the last few years, probably we've had double whammies of droughts followed by extremely wet period. And I'm sure all your car windscreens and car number plates are a lot freer of insects than they used to be, which is a very sad indictment on the state of our natural environment. And not from this report, so it's not up there, but I'll just give another one. England was ranked a lowly 189th out of 210 countries in the world when it came to the intactness of our natural environment. We are pretty well down the bottom there, guys. And why? Well, let's face it, we did start the Industrial Revolution first. We did start the Agricultural Revolution first. We've got a head start on all those other countries in destroying things. But how can we do things more sustainably in the future? And that's what we really need to think about. Unfortunately, we are in this biodiversity crisis, but we can take action to double nature, and it is possible. Why priority natural landscapes? And I've noticed some terrible typos on this, so do excuse me. The habitat and species conservation approaches that have been the sort of bread and butter of conservation in the 20th century simply hadn't worked. The data supports that, the continuing decline of species, the continuing, not necessarily loss of habitats anymore, but the decline in quality of habitats is still happening, particularly as a result of pollution, but also things like climate change. And in 2010, Professor John Lawton undertook a report for government called the State of Nature Report. And all in vogue at the time was his summary of the English and, well, the UK nature protection policies and site protection system was it simply wasn't fit for purpose. It's too small, too fragmented, not joined up, and species need space to move. Habitats change in response to natural factors and climate change, and if there's not space for that to happen, they become poorer quality and the species populations continue to decline. And as those species and habitats decline, then that starts to affect natural processes, whether that's the pollination services that wild insects might be providing to our crops and wider society, or flood protection that habitats can provide in upper catchments to prevent flooding downstream. So the ultimate conclusion really is we need to think bigger and at a landscape scale. And the mantra, I think, sort of summed up, I was going to say 4 words, so I suppose if I don't hyphenate joined up, it's 5. More, bigger, better, and joined up. That is where we need to be looking at. So that is the approach that we start to take in looking at nature recovery networks across Cambridgeshire. And I've done several of these reports looking at some of the priority landscapes that were like the Great Fen and around Cambridge and around Peterborough and some of the areas. But we'd also done similar reports as we've done for you for Fenland District Council and East Cambs District Council to try and get a more joined up and holistic approach. The starting point is what have we got already? Those high value nature sites, the ancient woodlands, the floodplain meadows, the wetlands along the Ouse Valley, and knowing where those and the priority habitats are. Another key element, if we're to think bigger and better and more, is understanding the underlying soils, geology, landform, hydrology. There's no point trying to create a wetland if it's totally dry. There's no point trying to create chalk grassland if you're on clay. Just some pretty obvious things. But also, we looked at the evidence base that's been published nationally by Natural England and others, and various amalgamations of research papers to look at how best to identify ways of promoting nature recovery and identifying the best places to do that. And there's a good body of evidence out there. And I'll use a couple of examples with the maps that come up to sort of describe, to show the approach in a bit more detail. But basically, it's identify your areas of core habitat. If they're too small, identify where they can be made bigger, or join together two small or three small ones to make one big one. Reducing the gaps between habitat patches, so that particularly, say, a specialist ancient woodland species is not going to jump 1 kilometre over to a woodland over there. It's either going to need some really amazing, tall, thick, dense hedgerow, or another couple of woodlands in between for it to be able to move from one woodland to the other. And why is that important? Well, say something happens untoward in that woodland, I don't know, it all dies of ash dieback, and suddenly it's all open and it's no longer damp and dark. And that nice little beetle, it's gone. It's no longer living there, and it ain't getting back because it doesn't fly, that one, it walks. But that's just one example. And it applies to all habitats. So reducing the gaps between habitats, and it doesn't have to be really small gaps. It can be bigger gaps for things that obviously fly, like many insects and birds. The connectivity works in different ways. For a small species that walks, things need to be really close. If you're a bit bigger and you fly, actually a habitats 2 or 3 kilometres apart, no problem. But it's understanding that. And then also, as part of this landscape recovery, we were looking at priority natural landscapes is to aim for areas where it would be possible to achieve a 30% cover of high quality natural habitats or wildlife-rich farm margins and headlands. And why that 30%? That has been shown in numerous scientific studies at which the point at which connectivity starts to become real again, and species and habitats can be better quality because they're bigger, they're more varied, they might cover high ground, low ground, dips, slopes, dry bits, wet bits. And you can start to build up not just the diversity of species, but also that bioabundance, that richness of species. So that 30% is key. So if we looked at Huntingdonshire as a whole and the fragmented habitats, well, there's no way we're going to get anywhere near 30% in any short order. But within a generation, in the priority natural landscapes that we've identified, it would be possible to start to get towards that critical 30% land cover of high-value natural habitats and supporting farmed habitats to make a meaningful difference. And I'll come on to what about the bits outside of those at the end, because but that's just a few of the principles. And don't need to necessarily look, I'll try to do this map in colour without having to rely on text. So we've got there in purple hatch the Great Ouse Valley floodplain, in effect. That's one of the priority natural landscapes. It's pretty self-explanatory. What's the boundary to a floodplain? That's where you can create wetland. You're not going to be doing it on high ground outside of the floodplain. It's a natural boundary. That's a pretty obvious one, and probably the easiest one to define. Actually, within the Ouse Valley, there's also quite a lot of existing habitat, whether it's the former sand and gravel pits, the remnant floodplain meadows, small pockets of woodland in places. Actually, in the Great Ouse Valley, in thinking about that nature recovery, it's not necessarily about more, but it is about better and perhaps a bit more joined up, in that there's an awful lot of grassland that is species poor, that 40 years ago, 50 years ago, was flower-rich meadow, that is now mostly ryegrass or grasses. It's not supporting pollinators. And it's really sad. And if they last another 10 years, the first stewardship schemes would have come in, and Huntingdonshire probably would have had an air of outstanding natural beauty along its Ouse Valley because of the richness of meadows. Unfortunately, we missed the boat by 10 years, and the agricultural improvements of the 70s and 80s unfortunately removed a lot of those. But they are restorable. The soils are still healthy. They've not been ploughed up. They've been grassland all along. Actually, better is possible. And And just then briefly considering one of the other areas, if I go to the left-hand side, and the teal-hatched area, which is Brampton Wood to Grafton Water down to the River Kim. That's a bit different. Obviously, you've got Grafton Water as a huge reservoir and drinking water supply in the middle. Most of the rest of the habitats in that area are ancient woodlands or flower-rich meadows. You've got Brampton Wood, the second largest ancient wood in Cambridgeshire and Huntingdonshire. You've got Perry Wood south of Grafton Water, Little Paxton Woods, Diddington Wood to the south and east, and a network of flower-rich meadows that still survive around the village of Southo. And they're really quite special in overall terms. But many of those sites are relatively small. In between, there's a few small farm woodlands that have been planted at various times over the previous decades. But actually, outside of Grafton Water and around Ringit, the ring of land around it, although there's a concentration of habitats, they're still quite isolated. There, how can the small ones be made bigger? And actually, there's quite a few places with relatively small-scale habitat creation would turn 3 or 4 small sites into one bigger one. There's a lot of hedgerows in some part of it, but they're this high, they're that wide, they're absolutely no use to breeding birds. A hedgerow is not a corridor unless it's a dense bit of scrub, as if you're a bird. You're not going to breed in it if you can see underneath it and your dog can run through the base. It's no good for breeding birds. So those hedgerow networks, actually with very little impact on the productive farming, could be enhanced with a little bit, well, quite a little bit less intense management and allowing them to become a bit wider and taller, allow some hedgerow trees. Actually, it doesn't need to take away from farming. And the other thing I want to say is actually in all of these areas, except perhaps the Great Fen, farming is going to remain the predominant major land use. If we go for 30% natural habitat, that's still 70% that's farmland. And of that 30%, some of it's still going to be farmland because it might be a really good wide thick hedge. It might be a flower-rich headland margin. So it's not about completely changing what we do. It's about the way we manage land better and more sustainably. I think moving on. And then just my final example, I will include the Great Fen. Unfortunately, I don't have time to go through all 9 priority landscapes and how each of them were identified and why they're important and what the opportunities are and the approach to nature recovery that could be taken. That's all in the detailed report because it is subtly different depending on the landscape and depending on the location. We've tried to make sure that it's based on the nature recovery network is based on local knowledge, local information, and things that fit with the local farming systems and local land use. The Great Fen is perhaps the one exception because that is the one area where there are ambitions to create one massive swathe of habitat. I don't believe actually we're ever going to get to 37 square kilometres, the whole lot. I think it can probably be divided in 2 realistically, in that the northern and eastern bits that will connect Woodwater and Holme Fen, the bright green in the bottom, with Holme Fen National Nature Reserve, the bright green in the top, is in the north and east of the Great Fen. That's where the best opportunity to create a wild fen wetland environment that can also support recreation and actually be an inspirational place for people to come and visit. I suspect in the western edge towards the main East Coast Railway and down towards the south of the clay soils, farming will continue to be the major land use, but again, more environmentally friendly farming can complement that wilder wetland creation that the Wildlife Trust and Natural England are embarking on to the north. And the hatched green area shows the land, well, it's not all the land because we've got Speeches Farm to add to it now, which we'll be restoring over the next 5 years, where it now will allow us to fully connect Woodwater Fen and Holme Fen, but also we've now got 2 farms together that form their own hydrological unit, that the water levels can be raised without impacting any of the neighbouring farmers who still want to carry on farming. So we've now got a big enough area where that wilder wetland can start to be created. And so that sort of gives a bit of an example. That's a different approach. Looking at Huntingdonshire overall, outlined there in the bold black line, these are the 9 priority landscapes shown, and you can see how they do connect across the whole district as a whole, how they cover the south, central and north of the district, but also how they link to similar areas out beyond the borders of Huntingdonshire District Council into South Cambridgeshire, East Cambridgeshire, Fenland, Peterborough, Northamptonshire and Bedfordshire. We're not just thinking in isolation. In preparing this, a nature recovery network isn't just about one place. It's got to go from Dover to Caithness and Sutherland and John O'Groats to Land's End, whatever, however you want to do it, the Wash to the Severn. We've got to think joined up beyond our own individual patches. Together, those areas that we've highlighted as the priorities to start the nature recovery process cover about 30% of the district. So there's only limited resources that we can put into nature recovery, whether it's through biodiversity net gain, stewardship schemes, farm businesses being able to afford to set aside a proportion of their land and still make a living, or the efforts of nature conservation charities or the public sector, such as Huntingdonshire District Council. The resources are finite. We do need to concentrate in some areas for the larger scale habitat schemes, and these areas provide that focus. That's not to say that nature recovery shouldn't and can't happen elsewhere. Everyone can play their part. And if I just think of two of the white areas there, which sort of may feel a little bit aggrieved, but let's take the fens. Except for the Great Fen area, farming is going to remain predominant in that Grade 1 agricultural land, and so it should. However, even those fenland farmers out west of Ramsey and around there, they can still play their part in nature recovery. There are regionally important populations, if not nationally important populations of waterfowl across the fens. All those farm ditches are connected. Where the water's clean enough, some of the really rare species that aren't just confined to Woodwalton Fen or Holme Fen or Wickham Fen in East Cambridgeshire. Actually, they do live in farm ditches if the water's clean enough. They actually contribute to that wider fens network. But could some of those ditches be more sensitively managed or perhaps ploughed a little less right up to the top of the bank? Yes, they could, without massively impacting farming incomes or our unnecessary food production. Different ways of farming. And then thinking of the area to the west of Huntingdonshire, there was a farmer there that did describe it. So I'm quoting someone else. Don't shoot the messenger. No. He described himself living in an agricultural desert. He's doing his bit on his farm, but pretty much all the really good hedgerows were lost with Dutch elm disease. So there were hedgerows, there were elm trees, there were magnificent trees out there, wiped out in the 70s and 80s. But alongside intensification of agriculture, most of the hedgerows were ripped out as well, which wasn't Dutch elm disease. And yet, nonetheless, those claylands are feeding, and where does the water run off the claylands? It goes into the Olconbury Brook, it goes into the Ellington Brook. It starts to cause flooding downstream. And in spite of the past deepening of those brooks, and they're pretty much destroying their value as nature habitats, we've still got a flooding problem downstream. Actually, natural flood management measures, taking up a very tiny proportion of each farm, could do a massive benefit to reducing the flooding in downstream communities, but also providing a bit of space for nature. If you've got leaky dams on the farm drain so it holds the water back or makes it come off less slowly, if you've got wider farm margins or tree planting along those farm ditches and along the Ellington and Olconbury Brook, it will help intercept water and again slow the flow. And those areas are often the marginal ones when it comes to growing crops. You're probably not making as much profit, if any, on some of those areas as you are in the centre of the fields. So again, thinking about those farm margins, there's things that could benefit wider society. So there may not be landscape scale massive habitat creation, but linear habitats in the right place could have immense benefit. So that's just sort of a couple of examples how actually nature recovery, and we've talked about it in the report, yes, we've got the priority natural landscapes, but there's ways of nature-friendly farming everywhere. But there's also, all of us can play our own part in where we live, our gardens or our window boxes if we're in a flat, or the communities we live in, the green spaces, whether that's in a village or a town. Actually, nature recovery can happen actions can be taken everywhere. And so I know I've also been working with some of your colleagues at some of the Huntingdonshire District Council officers on the Biodiversity for All programme, and hopefully we're going to be coming up with some series of measures that can be taken, where people live, where they can see it in action. But when it comes to sort of some of the larger scale habitat creation, whether focusing agricultural stewardship schemes or biodiversity net gain habitat banks for off-site habitat biodiversity net gain delivery, then these coloured priority landscapes really do need to be the focus in the short term. If we're successful in the next generation, actually, we might be able to think more about what are the extra nature-friendly farming bits that can be done in those white areas. But that's me done. I'm sure I went over 10 minutes because I always do, and sorry for that.
Thank you so much, Martin, and I really appreciate your enthusiasm and your passion for the work that you do. Has anyone got any questions or comments? Councillor Alban.
Thank you, Chair. I've got a couple of questions for Martin, then later on, if that's okay with you, I've got a couple of questions for Helen and Nick. I'm very much aware of not turning this into a ward surgery because there's so much of this that's in my ward, particularly the Great Fen. And when we eventually get round to picking up Councillor Hunt's idea of finding out more and going on a visit, it's one of the things that struck me looking at those slides is how much what's similar between Woodwalton Fen and Home Fen, but what the differences are in two sites so close together. So yeah, very special part of Huntingdonshire. So the two questions are access to the sites isn't always obvious, particularly the woodlands. If you could reassure me that those sites are accessible to people without causing too much disruption. And the other, perhaps more meaty question was, what level of engagement was there in producing this report with the parish councils affected, in particular around the fens, the inland drainage boards and the middle level commissioners, please?
I'll cover the meteor one first, if that's okay, and then you remind me what the first one was. We have talked to some major land owners as we've gone through this, and likewise with the other district things, but there hasn't been extensive engagement as such with the parish councils and in that sense, partly because this was not going to be this was more sort of technical evidence based. It was not feeding into things like local plans and sort of some of that public policy and public strategy. It's not those documents where there's established procedures for community and participation and engagement. It was really about being an evidence base about where the natural environment is at its best and where the opportunities are. So I'll be honest, there wasn't public consultation involved at my stage of here, but I understand that through the Biodiversity for All programme, I think that's for Helen and Nick to sort of perhaps explain how it translates into that and policy, if that's okay. With respect to IDBs, well, with respect to the Great Fen, that's gone through a consultation and that's developed over the last 20 years. And obviously the IDBs and the Middle Level Commissioners are one of the partners in the Great Fen, as our Huntingdonshire District Council. So many of the plans there are being done in a more collaborative way, though appreciating that what we're doing is not supported by everyone. But there is a wide consensus now in favour of what we're doing, though not everyone supports it, and I appreciate that. And then the first question was?
I think it's about access, making sure access is identifiable. Some of the sites are more easily identifiable where access is than others.
So again, this wasn't designed to be an access study. So there's the public rights of way network, which some woodlands have public rights of way through them and around them. There's also some woodlands, such as those managed by us, where we have a presumption in favour of public access where that isn't of detriment to nature. Unfortunately, many of our woodlands recently and the warm, wet winters, our woodlands are generally survived on the heaviest, thickest clay soils. They're the ones that hold the water the most, and places like Worsley Woods and even parts of Brampton Wood, we've had to close on occasions. So access is there, but there's times when that will cause an adverse impact and access has to be closed. We've not, in terms of wider access, I think there's other studies, and I know there was the Cambridgeshire Green Infrastructure Strategy done previously. Huntingdonshire have done an awful lot on access within their remit, the Ouse Valley Way, access to Little Paxton. Obviously, you don't own any woodlands as such, but on the small ones at Hinchinbrook. And so there's not going to be wholesale access to woodlands because that's going to come down to the individual landowner's preference. So let's take one of the big estates. Also, I'd mentioned Abbots Ripton. Yeah, there's access on the public rights of way, but there's not access to most of the woodlands. Some of them might be used for shooting, some of them might use for other things. So there's going to be a mixed picture. There's some woodlands that have got access, there's some that haven't. Hopefully across the district as a whole and each of those woodland clusters, there's enough woodlands that people can actually visit and enjoy the bluebells in spring or the bird song.
Councillor Shaw.
Thank you. This brilliant. I'm such a massive supporter of this. I think biodiversity net gain and credits is going to be a game changer as far as nature recovery is concerned. I'm not going to argue with Wildlife Trust's knowledge on natural environment. It was a very thorough report and very detailed. I was surprised to learn that obviously Cambridgeshire has one of the lowest proportions of priority habitats in England. And I thought, well, why don't we have more than 10 sites? But then as I read the report, realised that they're quite vast areas and quite a good spread, in my opinion, of around the district. In the report, we identified 9 sites, but I noticed in our part of the report on page 23, it's got 10. Is that because were rivers bolted on the end of it, I think, perhaps?
Yes, it's the river. It's the rivers are sort of like, and I'd say rather than sites, I think it's important. So I think you use the term priority natural landscapes because it is at landscape scale. It's not individual sites. Within each landscape, there's multiple sites. So it's more those 10 landscapes or 9 landscapes and the river corridors.
Thank you. Councillor Hassan.
Yeah, thank you. Probably for all of you, really. I just wondered, have you had the opportunity to present this to LPAG, the Local Plan Advisory Group?
No, this is our first step. So we just wanted to present the evidence base that Martin has provided. So yeah, this is our first stop.
So, Chair, I'd like to make a recommendation, if we could, that is brought before the Local Plan Advisory Group on the grounds that I think for the local plan going forward, knowing where the biodiversity priority areas, I think is really important. At LPAG, I did make a recommendation because we're just about, well, in process of going out to consultation. I did make a recommendation, actually something along the very lines. So residents have been given the opportunity to look at various models of where we might develop. So, for example, along road networks, along public transport networks, and some hybrid options. And I wanted to make an additional proposal, which is actually saying, could we avoid areas that you've got shaded on the map that's actually in front of me? That wasn't taken up, unfortunately, because I would actually like to consult residents on this, because I think there are, as you can quite see, there's large swathes of the county that aren't such priority habitats. But we haven't completed the local plan as yet. So if I could make that recommendation that you present this, and then we will see what recommendations come from LPAG back to Cabinet.
Helen, we'll bring Helen in first.
Thank you, Councillor Hassel. Just wanted to reassure everyone that these priority landscapes are very much locations where we want to enhance and not inhibit development, as you say. So this is actually forming part of a evidence base that we will be pushing into the local nature recovery strategy, which is being led by county. That will be a planning document, and that will actually have, just going back to Councillor Orban's comment, that will have the formal consultation built into it at that point. County Council will be doing that for us, well, not for us, but on behalf of the CPCA. Sorry, too many acronyms. Hopefully that makes it a bit clearer.
Martin, did you want to come in?
Yeah, so obviously I work across Cambridgeshire and working with some of the other districts or the cities, city councils as well. And I say this very much setting a framework for nature recovery and priority areas for nature recovery. Clearly within those areas, you look at the Great East Valley, you've got the market towns of St Neots, Huntingdon, St Ives. It's not saying there shan't be any development. Mind you, I've identified areas of floodplain for nature enhancement. Would you really be building houses in the floodplain? So there's some that naturally are not going to go together. If someone was proposing a new town like they are in one of your neighbours, neighbouring local authority areas, priority landscape areas, we and many others and local communities and local residents are up in arms, jumping about trying to object to it. If someone's proposing extensions to villages for affordable housing for people, no, it's not. There's a local plan process to determine where housing goes, but I think it's about having the right housing and the right development in the right places. So they're not incompatible, but a new town in the middle of one of those might, or a garden village might be slightly more challenging.
If we can just come back on that one, just to say, sitting on the LPAG, it would be absolutely fantastic to get this overlay so that we don't inadvertently put a major town or something like that in the middle of somewhere, because once it's in the local plan, it's very difficult to unwind, whereas at this stage, where it's still in development, it seems the most sensible time to discuss it.
Thank you. Mike wanted to come in.
Thank you, Chair. Oh.
Yeah, no, it's on, yeah.
Thank you, Chair. We are slightly straying in terms of some of Martin's comments into areas that aren't focused on the report. So just kind of remembering in that frame of reference, the key point really is this is a technical study that we've had done. It forms an evidence base that then will be used in planning decision making if we need to. We can use that in advance of the local plan if we need to, Councillor Hassel. If we've got, for example, an appeal, for example, that is being challenged on biodiversity grounds, we might present this as part of our evidence to defend our position. Now, in terms of as we move forward with the local plan, again, it will form part of that background evidence that informs our development strategy, our detailed policies about landscape, biodiversity, geodiversity, etc., and will ultimately be out there for consultation from, that developers can respond to, that other statutory consultees, Natural England might pick up on, and the public can respond to as well when we get further down the line. And ultimately we'll be examined and tested by an inspector. So working it back through, if we're presenting a policy that is specific and that recognises our priority landscapes to an inspector, the first thing they're going to do is say, right, where's the evidence base that supports that? And that's where this report comes back to. So as Helen said, this is part of a framework, but it would put us in a much better position than we stand as it is now, that if we've got speculative applications, we can use it as an evidence base once we've adopted it and once we've considered it.
So.
Yeah, my point being is the local plan advisory group is that if they don't have this information, which they don't at the moment, then it's very, very difficult for them to advise. So take all your points on board, very, very sensible points, but ultimately it's about education really, and I think that it's great that we've had this at Scrutiny, but LPAG are unaware, and they're going to be the ones who are giving advice to Cabinet, so they have a lot of weight. So I think it's really important that this team presents again. At what stage, I'm not certain, because it sounds like there are elements that need to be enhanced or whatever, but I think the earlier they get to LPAG, the better, in my opinion.
Thank you, Chair. I think you may have a time constraint on that because we've got 7 days before that goes to Cabinet now. That would have to be up to Democratic Service to figure that one out. But it is going to full council. So on the 16th of the 10th of this month, it will be at full council, albeit over scrutiny, cabinet, full council.
Sorry to come back on. So I don't have a problem with it going to full council or wherever. I think it's just really important that the people who are looking at the local plan and advising on it get that information. It doesn't have to be in the next week or hold up the process that's happening at the moment. It just means that all I'm asking for is to recommend that you do present to LPAG so that my fellow members can actually take it on board and understand it. And frankly, they need to understand it better than council and probably scrutiny.
So if I could jump in from a democratic point of view, this document is going on to Cabinet and then on to full council in October. But from my understanding, what you would like to suggest, Councillor Hassel, is that in addition to those two meetings that are already planned in, you would like this panel to recommend that LPAG also see this document on an additional time aside from those two times that it will be seen in the cycle. And if we're going to do that, you would need to propose that and there would need to be a seconder and then we'll take a vote. That recommendation will then go forward to Cabinet and it's up to Cabinet whether they choose to adopt that recommendation or not and take it forward. But obviously this panel can advise that. So is that correct in sort of assuming that that was what you would like to propose?
Absolutely, thank you.
So, as my understanding is that Councillor Hassel would like to propose that you add a recommendation to Cabinet that they also send this presentation and report to the LPAG group. Is there a seconder for that? Councillor Mockball? And then, sorry, I'll just turn that off too quickly. Could we have a vote for all of those in favour of that? Oh.
Just to clarify, I think it needs to have the team as well, along with the report, and not just a document. If you can just be a bit more specific, but yeah, it looked like it got voted.
Well, if I could just have the vote of hands again, because I will need to record the vote. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hassel. Moving on now to Councillor McKellen.
Thank you, Chair. This is just more general, really, just asking for a little bit more information. You mentioned about the nature-friendly farming people. I've come across this organisation before. I'm assuming that they are aware of what we're doing, of this scheme. Yeah. What I would like to know really is what percentage of farmers are involved with this roughly in hunting and shear, and those that aren't, are they also being kept informed of what we're trying to do and encouraged to actually partake? Thank you.
So start with, in referring to nature-friendly farming, I wasn't specifically referring to the nature-friendly farming group led by Martin Lyons down in Croxton way. No, it's just, that's South Cambridge, it's just in your district. But yes, in doing this sort of work elsewhere, I've been closely involved with him and other sort of chairs of local farmer clusters. What proportion of farmers are adopting what I'd call nature-friendly farming across hunting and shear? I honestly wouldn't like to venture. I don't have that knowledge. I'm not going to make a guess. That'd be unfair. Are more starting to look at it? Yes, definitely. There's through Natural Cambridgeshire that I'm a trustee of as well, and through the work of Wildlife Trust and Farming Wildlife Advisory Group, RSPB, others. There's now about 7 or 8 farmer clusters covering quite a large chunk of Cambridgeshire. Interesting more, these farmer clusters are often led by farmers. We're only providing a facilitating, supporting role. It's not for me to tell a farmer how to farm, but we can provide advice on how you can do it in a nature-friendly way if someone wants to listen. So more and more people are looking at it. There's a bit of a generational shift starting to come through in farming. People generally farm for their whole lives. There's an awful lot of farmers who are over 60 and even over 70 and some approaching 80. We're getting close to quite a significant moving towards the generations and the sons and daughters or others taking over. And with that, there's often a change of approach and sometimes attitude because they were taught different things when they went to agricultural college, and environment might have been part of the course, whereas it wasn't for the grandparents or the father. So I think it's increasing. We're at the early, if we're on a curve, we're at the early point here. I think in the next 10 years, you're going to see some significant changes to how people go about farming and an awful lot more opportunities to implement some of the ideas that we've set out in this report.
Thank you. Councillor Hunt.
Thank you. Just a quick one from me then. It's will this be updated in the future? If so, when? Is there an understanding? Is it a rolling program? Is it something that's a bit of a one-off? Or yeah.
So it has been written so that it doesn't need to be updated in short order. Those landscapes are there. They're not going to change. Some of the detailed measures that might come forward or how those are brought forward in terms of action plans, yes, there could be a series of action plans at a shorter timescale.
That's just what I was going to say. So actually, in terms of it would be updates to it and sort of case study reviews, because as the LNRS comes forward, we'll be able to see how different projects are being identified using that. So actually, so obviously the geology is never going to change. So those priority landscapes are locked in, but it could very much be a document that we can review in the future.
Yeah. Thank you. Councillor Auburn.
Thank you, Chair. The questions for Nick and Helen, and perhaps Mike could come in as it picks up on something he said. So if we adopt this and it forms part of the planning process, say for, let's say, 20 houses on the edge of a village, a sort of a significant but not a hugely significant planning application, where would this fit in determining a planning application?
So just to remind you, this is very much an evidence base. So this is a document that will be used in when the LNRS is asked for a consultation from Huntingdonshire District Council. This is what we will feed into the LNRS. They are identifying specific areas that will then be used for identification for the BNG, I can't think what it's called, biodiversity net gain, thank you. So to identify those areas where those inputs and investments would be. So it wouldn't be used as a prohibitive for development, but what it will be is giving our planners locations that they can actually spend off-site contributions to effectively.
Mike would just like to come in as well.
Sorry, could I just add a bit more as the planner in the room? In terms of, in the example you've cited, so again, if we take that, so for example, somebody was to say, actually, this development will impact on a particular species that is a component of the priority landscapes. We might look at that and say, actually, that is a material consideration. You know, we'll look at this and use it as the evidence, and we might actually then reach a position where we say, you know, based on our planning policies or application of the NPPF, this would have a negative impact on our priority landscapes. That would then impact, you know, and in that context, there is a planning reason related to loss of landscape or loss of ecology, you know, something like that. If we then ended up at an appeal scenario, rather than having just a kind of finger in the air of what that impact might well be, we would have an evidence base. Now, it's not to say that that evidence base couldn't be challenged and, you know, that actually somebody could say, Martin's boundaries aren't precisely there, and actually this site is right on the edge, and therefore there's nothing in that particular area that is going to be impacted. Somebody could challenge it in that way, but it makes us have a much better starting point rather than having no evidence at all. So it will be a tool. It won't be the silver bullet, you know, that we'll be able to say, well, actually that means we can refuse applications or the opposite. We can approve applications because they might have a positive impact. it just gives us an evidence base that we can duly consider and weigh in the mix. The other side of it is, as Helen has said and Councillor Shaw has mentioned, biodiversity net gain is a new and evolving area. As a result of the planning process now, there is a statutory obligation in terms of net gain. One of the ways that people can provide that net gain is via credits. They can buy credits for investment, which then effectively means they offset their impact by buying those credits. Those credits can then be banked by organisations and used to invest in sites. So again, thinking forward and thinking slightly laterally, that might be a direction of travel that we can use this report to say, actually, we might want one of those priority landscapes to have an area within it that becomes a biodiversity net gain site that those credits can be spent on and invested in, and that's the other way it can be used. So two sides that this can play into the planning process, but the fundamental one is really, as Councillor Hassel has alluded to earlier, feeding this into our local plan process so that we can shape our plans, shape our development strategies in response to this, as well as many other evidence studies that we're undertaking.
Yeah, I'm just going to add to that in the respect of biodiversity net gain, as Mike and Helen have alluded to. It's not always possible, excuse me, for the developer to have that biodiversity net gain. I think it's about 10% that they have to have on their land while they're developing. So then this report gives us that opportunity to say, well, you can't do it there, but, we can do it here. So, yeah, just to add to that, it's not always possible for them to get that biodiversity net gain where they want to develop.
Thank you, Chair. Just on that, the idea of biodiversity net gain and credits, simple question, do those credits have to be cashed in within Huntingdonshire? So my concern then on that is that a developer that owns a piece of land in rural Scotland, miles from anywhere, that could cash in a net gain, and there would be a net gain miles and miles and miles from Huntingdonshire that we wouldn't see the benefit of. And there was another question as well. Shall I? Thank you, Chair. Yeah.
Thank you, Chair. To keep it short and sweet, it's absolutely the challenge that has been seen with the system. So in effect, there's an organisation called the Green Infrastructure Bank or the Environment Bank that are out there. They are national organisations. Now, the priority and prioritisation is that you should look to do it in the local area first, and you have to go through those steps. Equally, through planning policy and policy development, there is the opportunity to focus it down to a more local level first and foremost. So effectively, you make a developer go through those steps to say, can you provide it on site, yes or no? Can you provide it in the immediate locality, yes or no? If you're buying a credit, then you go through exactly the same process, and it then gives you that a bit more cover to be able to try and get those benefits locally. But it is exactly one of those challenges that every authority up and down the country is grappling with.
Please. So on that, also in the way that the biodiversity units are calculated, if you want to go and do that in Scotland rather than Huntingdonshire, the way that they're calculated, you get penalised. And the further away you are, the more you get penalised. So you'll have to buy a lot more. But as the councillor over there says, you get your planning policies right, and actually there's no need for them to go away. And the other element is obviously having providers who are willing to provide them locally. And I am aware of 4 or 5 different landowners, and that's not including the Wildlife Trust, who are either exploring or have established habitat banks within your district and may be looking to secure some sort of Section 106 or legal agreement with the district council to enable them to be brought forward. So we have one in the Great Fen, but I'm aware there's another couple of landowners that are ready and 2 or 3 others who will be ready in the next few months at different parts of your district, in different ones of those priority areas, who would be willing to provide what's needed locally. So get the planning policy right. There are local providers, but actually they need support of the district council to have a planning agreement, a Section 106 agreement in place so that they can sell those biodiversity units to developers in Huntingdonshire. So get the whole process in right, and what you said won't come to fruition.
Thank you, Chair. My concern is we do get it right. I think that is somewhat reassuring. And one of the changes we've seen in Huntingdonshire, particularly in rural sites, is the loss of agricultural land to solar farms. And without getting into the whole debate about what the government may or may not do, I think the reality is there will be a pressure on losing agricultural land and losing green land. So I think it's even more important that Huntingdonshire, in terms of the joint administration and our officers, push on planning applications for and make it as easy as possible for biodiversity net gains to be spent in Huntingdonshire. The other question was on the recommendation 4 on page 22. It talks about, in consultation with the executive portfolio holder, to make any minor amendments to the priority landscapes of Huntingdonshire policy. I think it would serve the council well and serve the portfolio holder well that would define what a minor amendment is. Because at the moment, just on paper, it's sort of how long is a piece of string?
Through yourself, Chair. That is fairly common wording. So in effect, it enables us to make typographical errors or corrections to paragraph numbering, or, actually, the wording of paragraphs, provided they don't materially alter what that is trying to say. So provided it doesn't materially undermine the overall approach of the document, what the policy is trying to achieve, etc., then that gives us that flexibility. So it is a fairly common recommendation that is there, and the materiality is always going to be a question of judgment. But in effect, what we're saying is actually it enables those minor amendments to take place. For example, let's just say that an evidence piece needs to just be corrected over a percentage over a particular species, provided it doesn't undermine the overall policies of the report. It enables that flexibility to make that change.
I was suggesting, Chair, could that be Mike's explanation be put into the document so somebody else doesn't ask the same question further down the line?
Again, through yourself, Chair, it's not something that we would commonly do, but again, because of the nature of the wording, and for example, if somebody was to challenge over the nature of a change that's made, we would get legal advice on that if necessary. So it is ultimately a subjective matter. The minutes will be here in terms of the response that you've been given, that can be read there as well. So I don't think that's necessary, if I'm honest, Councillor Alban.
Just to advise as well, obviously the comments that you've just made and had the answer will also be included within that report as part of the ONS comments. So it will be within the report by the nature of the fact that the ONS comments will be recorded within the report for as it goes on in the democratic process, if that makes sense.
I think that's useful, Chair, that it's there in the public domain. One last question, if I may, to Martin. Martin, you mentioned about there's some opposition to what was being has been undertaken. Just for completeness, and without going into details or compromising individual comments, what is the nature of the opposition? Because to me, what's being presented seems positive, but I'm wanting to get the whole picture.
That was in reference to at the Great Fen, where obviously we have some pretty major landscape scale change is planned. Not all of the not all of the tenants within the Great Fen adhere to that long-term vision. There's one of them that actively objects to that. They're a tenant of ours. They have a secure tenancy. They can carry on farming legally within that tenancy. And I'm sure some councillors who may have been around a longer time, I know there was a councillor for that area as well in the past who was vociferously opposed to the concept of the Great Fen. However, many of the farmers, including some of our tenants, have actually changed their approach to farming. One of them's a major contractor for us now. He actually didn't want to farm anymore. He's changed his business and how he makes income. So it was purely in relation to the Great Fen and our approach there. But we've got to be a responsible landlord as well as a visionary nature conservation organisation that's trying to create a wild wetland. It's got to be done with people. We can't just flood someone out, which is why I explained earlier. The bits that we're flooding are
are now within our control that we can do without harming anyone else who wants to continue farming. So it's a long-term venture, and we need to bring people with us as much as we can.
Thank you. I'm very conscious of the time. I've still got Councillor Lowe. Would you like to ask a question? And then Councillor Shaw, and then Councillor Hassel. Hit brief because we get.
Thank you, Chair. Sorry about that. No, I think mine was really, obviously farmers are going to know about things, but if there's any out there that don't and I get asked questions, how would I go about referring them to yourselves to get more information about nature-friendly farming and how wide the hedgerows have to be beneficial, etc.? I don't need the answers right now, but I just want a referral point.
Unfortunately, I deleted the last slide, which had all my contact details on because of who I was giving the presentation to. But you're welcome to come to the Wildlife Trust. Wildlife Trust in Beds, Cambs and North Hants. We've got all the standard website and contact details. And you can quote my name, Martin Baker, in dispatches.
Councillor Shaw.
Thank you. I suspect some of these have been covered, but I just wanted to clarify my own thinking. So am I right in saying that we're hoping to fund these projects from biodiversity net gain credits, essentially, so off-site credits, is that correct? And how do we ensure that those credits go to these projects? Is that, I think it was possibly mentioned S106 agreements, perhaps? And who administers the credits?
I was going to see that hospital pass from across the room there, Helen. Yeah, so in terms of we're straying slightly away from this. So in terms of biodiversity net gain credits, that is something that is administered by us. It's new burdens that we've got through the planning process to do that. There are various mechanisms. It's still an emerging system, so it's quite young. It's only about a year old, if that. And at the moment, that is by virtue of various forms of legal agreements, and that is then administered by us as HDC. As we move forward, as I said earlier, planning policy will develop, the legislation will develop, the guidelines will develop over time as well. So hopefully we'll refine that system as we go. Doesn't mean to say that if we get a credit, for example, that it will go straight to one of these sites. But this is, as Helen has said earlier, this is an opportunity for us to then say, actually, we'd like it spent in this area. But as Martin quite rightly said earlier, we've got sites that have been put forward in the call for sites that are biodiversity banks and habitat banks, or proposed.
Would these credits be something that local communities could claim, for example, for small projects in their communities, or is it for more large-scale developments?
I'd need to come back to you on the clarity around that, but my instinct is it doesn't matter who delivers it, principally, provided they are delivered in response to the necessary criteria that are set out. So, you know, you would ordinarily you would go to an organisation like the Wildlife Trust, like Natural England, like an established habitat bank, because they have to give a commitment over 30 years. It's not just a case of put it in and walk away. They have to then manage that improvement for that period of time. So we are going to be looking to work with those reputable organisations, in inverted commas.
As a habitat bank provider, we have to register nationally, and to do that, so again, there's some national oversight by Natural England, as well as whatever local oversight there is with Huntingdonshire District Council. And because of that minimum 30-year commitment, you've got to make sure that it's watertight, that it doesn't fail. But there was one other thing you said about biodiversity net gain is one element to achieving nature recovery in those priority landscapes. There's many other things that contribute to that. Stewardship schemes that farmers may enter into, just farmers doing more nature-friendly farming as part of their business plan, or because their Tesco's contract says they have to do it. There could be many different ways. There could be action taken on parish council land. There could be action taken on Huntsditch Sea land. So there's a multitude of different, it's a much wider vision than just BNG, biodiversity net gain.
And finally, Councillor Hassel.
Yeah, so Martin, thank you very much for all that information. And I think when you hopefully come along to LPAG, we need some guidance as to how we can build all this into our local plan as best we can under the legislation, all the controls, et cetera, et cetera. Just a very quick question. In terms of the corridors, are there enough east-west corridors?
That's a very good question. And I don't think we're going to know for a while, because there's, and also how do species move, and and what do they move in between, and how do they move? Actually, it becomes much more complex than that. Most of the movement needs to be north-south, right, in terms of climate change, rather than east-west. But I think we can increase species populations and the resilience of species and the bioabundance in these areas. Actually, things then start to spread out. I'll give a different analogy. It's a marine one, but Lundy Marine Nature Reserve off the coast of Devon. There was a lot of objections with fishermen and things, and lobster fishermen to that when it happens. But it was set up, and what happened, the populations of lobsters built up inside it so much that they started to spread out into the catch zones, and the other fish started to go out to the areas where the fishermen could fish, and they've actually got better catches now of lobsters and other things because of the nature reserve. So it's not quite the same, but actually if we get the priority landscapes more nature rich, actually things will start to use the surrounding farmland as well, and will start to move. We may find that we do need more woodlands or more meadows east-west in time. That'll be a future iteration.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate your coming here today and presenting to us, Martin, Nick and Helen. It's been really helpful to understand this, and we hopefully we've got a good recommendation for Cabinet. Thank you for your time. And with that, we'll draw this meeting to a conclusion. Thank you everyone for your contributions. Does everyone want a 5-minute break before we move into the second session? Get a drink, go for the loo.